to Adventure Stories ASMR!
3 true horror stories. Welcome to the very first episode of True Horror Stories. I am your host, Adventure Stories ASMR. The following 3 tales are all true. They come from my own past, or stories that have been told by my friends and family, or complete strangers who were telling their tales and didn't know that I was listening. The following stories will be told from the point of view of the character in question, the one who experienced the horrors firsthand. The first story will be one from my past. I call this story The Witch's Cemetery. It was about 7 years ago, when I and my family had decided that we were going to do something different for Halloween. We had gone trick-or-treating before, we had watched spooky movies on a Halloween night, but this time was different. We decided that we wanted to go to some place that was really haunted, some place with ghosts. So, we booked our tickets to a tour ride to the Witch's Cemetery. In town, there's a legend that 200 years ago, a witch was killed in the cemetery of our town. Many people have told it many times. A young woman was suspected of witchcraft. She was hunted down, given a quick trial, and found guilty. She was hung on a very large tree near the edge of the cemetery. It was later revealed that many of her heinous witchcraft was done very nearby, near a stream. And to this day, locals swear that when you enter the witch's pentagram at the edge of the river, you can hear voices calling out to you, and a strange feeling as if you're being watched. So, of course, my family and I decided that we were going to go down there and investigate ourselves. At about 7 o'clock, we all joined the tour group, which then divided into 2 separate, smaller groups. One went to the haunted railroad about 3 city blocks over. But we were going to the Witch's Cemetery. The journey took us about 25 minutes to walk across multiple bridges and walk through several city blocks before we reached the edge of the forest. Since it was a cold and cloudy October night, darkness had already fallen with its veil by the time we reached the cemetery. We could barely see in front of us without the use of flashlights. The tour guide stopped at the entrance of the cemetery. He told us about the creation of the cemetery, which dated back almost 300 years. He then pointed to several of the mausoleums which housed many of the richest members of the cemetery. As he walked through the path which we were supposed to follow, I got this eerie feeling that I was being watched. I took out my camera and began to film. I didn't see anything at first, but the whole time I just got this feeling like I was being watched, as if several pairs of eyes were watching me. My family and I also felt it, and the temperature had dropped several degrees since we even entered the cemetery. Once we got near the back, though, that was the end of the tour. He pointed over to where the witch's grave was supposed to be. The tombstone has since been removed due to teenage kids trying to find it and do who knows what to the tombstone. And down below, into a deep creek, was what was left of the old river. You could barely hear it through the rustling of the leaves as the wind blew by. By this point, darkness had completely taken over the entire night sky, and the only way you could see what's in front of you was your cell phones or your flashlights. It was at this point that the tour guide decided to let everybody venture out into the rest of the graveyard and see it for themselves. Being the brave souls we were, my family and I decided to go down towards the embankment and then into the valley below. We wanted to see where the witches' ceremonies were done, and slowly but surely, we descended the steep hill covered in dead leaves. By this point, we could almost see our breath in front of us. The temperature had fallen so quickly. When we finally reached the bottom, it felt as if all the air around you was squeezing you from all sides. You felt heavy, almost as if you were coming out of the ocean. And every step you took felt as if you were 500 pounds. It was hard to breathe. It was at this point that I looked over my shoulder as I was filming. I thought I saw something between the trees. My mom also spotted it and pointed it out to us. When I panned over, I could see in my mind's eye that somebody was standing between the two trees. The camera didn't pick it up very well. It didn't have night vision, and even with our flashlights, it wasn't enough to really illuminate the area. But with my human eye, I could see the outline of someone standing between the two trees, just for a moment, and then it was gone. I liken it very much to the Predator's camouflage in the movie. This wavy, translucent, human shape standing between the two trees. It was at this point that my mom started getting messages in her head. Being a bit psychic, she started feeling like someone was trying to talk to her in her head. And that's when everything got really creepy. We started hearing what sounded like people moving in the forest. Twigs were snapping, leaves were moving, and yet we knew for a fact nobody else had joined us down here. They were too chicken to join us down in the valley below. And just as I thought about maybe going back up, I heard a witch's cackle. It wasn't exactly loud, but I could clearly make it out. It sounded like an old hag was laughing to the left of me. At that moment, I had to get the hell out of there. I started climbing up the embankment, and I heard my family following me. Our flashlights were moving so fast, I knew my family was running up the hill with me. By the time we got to the top, most of the other group had moved on, deciding to go to the haunted railroad, leaving just the four of us standing there at the top of the hill, wondering, what the heck did we just experience? People standing between trees, an old hag cackling. Was it all a trick? Had somebody come down with us without us knowing? An old lady, perhaps? Or was it real? When we got the videos and the pictures developed, we did notice a few orbs in the picture, but no outlines of anybody, and definitely no witch. But to this day, I still think about that night. I still wonder if perhaps we did encounter the witch of the cemetery. The next tale, the Babysitter Massacre, is one I overheard a friend talking about. A sad and horrific tale of several babysitters being slaughtered in a small town in the United States. So we'll begin on a hot August night somewhere in the US, and my guess it's somewhere in New England. So, New York. A young college girl that we'll call Brianna was tasked with watching two kids, a 12-year-old girl named Stacy and an 8-year-old boy named John. She, of course, has watched those kids before. However, She had previous plans to have a slumber party with her friends, but she got the call from her neighbors, a very nice couple, and she couldn't turn them down. So she asked her friends to join her, have a slumber party / babysitter night. It was around 9 o'clock when the other three finally joined her at the couple's household. Brianna was watching an old movie with the two kids when she got a knock at the door. When she looked through the glass window, she could see her three friends waving at her from the other side of the door. They were all smiles and had multiple backpacks and bags all over them as if they were about to go camping. She eagerly walked up to the door and opened it up and said hello to her friends. They each greeted her in kind as they usually do, and they walked into the door. It didn't take them long to completely take over the house. Blanket beds and blanket forts were strewn all over the living room, and the two kids had bunked up with their favorite babysitter for the night. After talking about ghost stories and having a couple laughs, the 4 college girls and the 2 kids finally went to bed, somewhere around 1 o'clock in the morning. They were suddenly awoken at 3:33 a.m. to the sound of scratching coming from the front door. Brianna woke up with a start, looked around for the source of the sound, and she couldn't see anything. It was far too dark. She turned on her cell phone and slowly walked towards the door. She looked through the small peephole and she didn't see anything. In fact, the parents still had not come back, which was very odd. They usually had come back by about 1 or 2 in the morning. In fact, she was convinced that they were going to wake her up sometime soon. Instead, the parking space was completely empty. There was no one there. It was dead silent. She crawled back into her blanket fort with the other 2 kids sound asleep. She wondered if she should tell anybody, but might have been a dog for all she knew. So she snuggled back in and closed her eyes. But not a minute later, and the door scratched again. Now definitely on edge, she got up much faster this time and went to the door to see if she could catch whatever it was making the sound. And yet again, when she looked through the peephole, no one was there. She then looked through the side window, maybe to see if there was a small dog or a cat scratching at the door. And there was nothing there. Just empty air above where the doormat was that said "Welcome home." By that point, the full moon had risen high in the sky and was starting to illuminate the small town below. Rays of moonlight shone through the many trees and the canopy of leaves above, and a thick fog began to form near the edges of the town, moving slowly inwards as if it had a mind of its own. Skeleton-like fingers of fog crept across the ground, slowly moving closer and closer towards her house. By this point, Brianna was very unnerved. Her constant pacing had finally woken up her best friend. We'll call her Kelsey. Kelsey walked up to Brianna and asked her what was wrong, and Brianna just replied,
I thought I heard somebody outside. Or at least something was scratching at the door.
Kelsey just told her what any rational person would. It was a small dog, or a cat, or a raccoon. It could have been anything, really. There wasn't anything to be concerned about. But that's when Brianna pointed out that the parents still weren't home yet, and it wasn't normal for them to stay out this late. Of course, Kelsey tried to comfort her and tell her everything was fine. Maybe they lost track of time. The 2 of them sat down by the couch, still a little too unnerved to go back to bed just yet. And they were talking amongst themselves about school, boyfriends, and their favorite shows. And that's when Brianna heard the most horrific sound she would ever hear in her life. The back door unlocked and swung open. Both girls sat straight up, shivers going down their spines, their eyes bulging with shock. They clearly didn't hear a car pull up. They didn't hear anything, to be honest. Just the sound of the door opening and creaking as it slid across the carpet. The two girls slowly turned their heads around so that in their peripheral vision they could finally see the back door. And when they looked, their stomachs fell to their feet and their hearts began to pound. For standing there in the doorway was a man, a tall man dressed in nothing but black. The only things that stood out about the man was that one, the man was over 6 feet tall. 2, the head was adorned with 2 horns. And 3, the man was holding a knife, a sharp butcher knife, in his right hand. The girls tried to scream, but nothing came out but gurgles and whimpers. Brianna tried to move. She tried to wake up one of her other friends, but her hand wouldn't move. She was frozen in place, obviously in shock. The man just stood there, staring directly into Brianna's eyes, as if he was trying to look straight into her soul. Then his mouth parted in the most horrific manner you could imagine. Sharp white teeth glistened in the darkness, his incisors longer and sharper than they should be. He almost didn't look human. Just as Brianna was about to scream, her friend Kelsey bolted from her spot, pushing Brianna back into her friends. Kelsey screamed as she ran through the house, trying to get to the upstairs. The man bolted as fast as he could, running through the kitchen and then up the staircase 2 at a time. Brianna screamed her lungs off, trying to get the attention of her friends and the 2 kids. Everybody shot up from their spot, screaming and trying desperately to find out what was wrong. Brianna could only get out something about a killer or a monster in the house. The 2 kids were so frightened they were holding on to each other and shaking like a leaf. Sweat began to bead from across Brianna's forehead. She had to do something quick. The first thing she thought of was calling 911. She called the dispatch and tried to get through. The other friends ran up the stairs to try to save Kelsey. They were screaming and brandishing their mace and whatever they could find to beat the assailant. The 2 kids stood right behind Brianna, scared to death to even move. As the dispatch told her to get into a central part of the house and lock the door, she heard a blood-curdling scream. Kelsey was screaming. The girls could easily be heard pounding on the door, trying to get in to save her, but the door was locked upstairs, with the killer in the room with Kelsey. Brianna ran into the bathroom with the 2 kids right on her back. She let them in first, and then shut the door behind them, locking it. She then grabbed the medicine cabinet and shoved it right into the door to keep the killer from getting in. The dispatcher told her not to move or make a sound, and do not open that door until the police arrived. They were already on their way. Brianna held on to the kids and tried to console them as tears ran down their cheeks. She too began to weep as she heard her friends screaming the name of Kelsey over and over again. Then there was a moment of silence before a loud crash, the door was busted into as the two girls finally got into the room. But when they got in there, they screamed so loudly the windows buzzed downstairs in the bathroom. Their friend, Kelsey, was dead. The two girls tried to get out of there, realizing there was no way they were going to win against someone like that. But the one friend was caught by her elbow and dragged back into the room. The other friend tried to save her, but it was already too late. Her throat had been slit, blood pooling all over the floor. The other friend was so terrified, she ran down the stairs, almost leaping down the last 3. She ran outside, screaming into the night. And then the house fell silent once again. Brianna held her hands over the mouths of the 2 kids. They still wept, but her hands kept most of the sound quiet. But all of them fell silent when they heard footsteps coming down the staircase. Slow, heavy footsteps. By the time the footsteps reached the landing on the first floor, all 3 of them could barely breathe. It's like they were holding their breath, trying not to even let their heartbeat give them away. The killer walked into the dining room, searched under the desk, under the table, then into the kitchen, opening up drawers, opening up cabinets, even opening up the refrigerator. But then he doubled back through the dining room, into the foyer, and then towards the bathroom in the back. The heavy footsteps came closer and closer until the wood right outside the door creaked as the man stood only a foot away. The doorknob on the door began to move and rattle. The kids started whimpering, but she tried to keep them quiet. She didn't want him to know they were in there, but the killer was too smart. He knew the door shouldn't be locked, and he started to pound his whole body weight into the door.
Boom! Boom! Boom!
The door began to crack under the powerful weight of the man's body. The kids started wailing and screaming. They called out for their mommy. They called out for their father. Brianna screamed for him to go away, and the cops were coming, but he didn't stop. He wasn't going to until everyone in the house was dead. However, fate was on their side. Sirens could be heard coming in the distance, getting closer and closer. Brianna heard the grunt of a man in frustration as he punched the door one last time and then ran off through the front door and out into the forest. By the time the police cars drove onto the parking space and across the lawn, the man was gone. The police went through the house, top to bottom, found the bodies, and of course called the coroner. When they got to the door with Brianna and the kids inside, they called out that they needed help. They moved the medicine cabinet away, opened the door, and into the waiting arms of the policemen. They took them away for safety back to the police department until their parents could arrive. In all, 2 of the babysitters had been murdered in cold blood. The other babysitter successfully got away and got to her home and also called the police. None of them were ever the same again. And to this day they tell the tale of the demon man who came into their home and killed their friends. And what's even more frightening is that the man is still at large. And our final tale of terror, the Haunted Scarecrow. My grandma always told me that I should never move that scarecrow. There is something odd about it, and every time I always asked my grandma why I shouldn't move the scarecrow, she always told me it was dangerous, or she would change the subject because she didn't want to upset us kids. But once I grew up and became a teenager, I just had to know why I shouldn't go near that scarecrow. Curiosity had finally gotten the best of me. So I and my best friend decided that we were going to investigate this scarecrow in our grandma's backyard. Beyond the beautiful garden that she always had was a piece of land covered in waist-high weeds. She never kept it up, and she never mowed it. She didn't want to go back there. It's the back acre of her property, and now that she's up in age and her husband's been long dead, she can no longer keep up with it. So I walked through the tall weeds with my friend and made our way back to the scary scarecrow. As we got closer, I noticed just why my grandma told me never to go back there. This was no ordinary scarecrow, not something made out of straw and cloth, but more like it was a human, made of flesh and bone. There seemed to be rotten flesh across its face, and hard, dark leather for clothes. It looked like it had been there for 100 years or more, and yet it still had flesh on its face. But by the time we got up really close to it, maybe within 20 feet of it, that's when we noticed it had maggots coming out of its eye sockets. It scared the crap out of us. We didn't want to go near it. My friend and I decided that we would abandon the whole thing, but when we tried to turn around, we heard something moving in the weeds behind us. I didn't want to look back, and neither did my friend. We just looked to the side and looked at each other. We stared at each other for so long, neither of us wanting to move, neither of us wanting to look back. In these situations, you just know, never look back. But my curiosity again got the best of me. I slowly turned around, and when I did, there was nothing there except the 6-foot stake of wood and a nail with flesh hanging from it. The scarecrow was gone. I screamed, and I screamed and ran as fast as my legs could carry me. I heard my friends screaming with me. We made record time across my grandmother's 5-acre farm, and we got to the back door and just ripped that thing open and slammed it shut and locked it. We started screaming for Grandma. Grandma, Grandma, the scarecrow's after us, it's alive. And when she came in, she knew instantly what was going on. She shut all the windows, locked them, and drew the curtains. She told us never to look outside and do not open any window or door, no matter what you hear. Of course, that just made me even more scared, and my friend kept telling me he wanted to go home. He wanted to go home. But my grandma told him not to leave the house. Do not leave until sunrise the next day. All night long, I kept looking towards the windows and doors as we ate dinner. And when we were sitting in the living room, I would keep hearing what sounded like someone trying to get in. Someone at the doors, scratching, knocking, banging his fist against the wood. And my grandma kept telling me, "Don't do it. Don't do it, honey. Don't open the door." And I listened to my grandma. When nightfall had finally come and we were starting to get a bit tired, and the sounds finally abated, I went upstairs to my bedroom with my friend, and he slept in his bed and I slept in mine. And as we pulled the covers over towards our neck, I wondered if the scarecrow was still there. It was when I looked to my window that I realized something terrifying. I forgot to close the curtains. You could clearly see outside the window at the night sky and the forest surrounding our farm. I didn't want to get up, but I knew if I didn't, that thing could try to get in. At least, maybe it could. I got up from my bed and slowly made my way across the room. My friend was still awake, and he kept telling me, "Don't do it, don't go by the window. Come back to bed." But I knew if I didn't close that curtain, I wouldn't be able to go to sleep anyway. I crept my way across the old wooden floor, and by the time I reached the window, my heart was racing 1,000,000 miles an hour. I looked out the window, just for a moment, and I didn't see anything. It just looked like my grandmother's backyard. There was nothing out of place, nothing weird. I closed the curtains and went back to bed and thought nothing of it. But the next thing I knew, I had awoken from my sleep. It was sometime during the night. My guess is somewhere around 3 to 4 a.m. I didn't have a clock at the time, so I didn't know what time it was. But all I know is that I had that eerie feeling, as if I was being watched. I looked over at my friend, who was still fast asleep. I felt like maybe I should wake him up, but I didn't want to wake him up out of a sound sleep for nothing. But when I turned my head back around, and I looked at the window, there, in the window, behind the closed curtains, was the outline of the scarecrow. Somehow it was floating there, outside the window, staring right through, peering through the window, and angling its head right at me in my bed, as if it knew I was sleeping there. And the curtains were still closed. How could it see me? How is it even flying outside the window? That's impossible. I tried to scream, but nothing came out. It's like my throat just closed up in fear. But the next thing I knew, it was gone. The window was completely vacant. There was nothing there. And I could finally scream. I yelled, "Scarecrow! The scarecrow's here! Wake up! Wake up!" My friend woke up with a start, and he started freaking out. I told him I saw the scarecrow in the window, and that's when my grandmother came in, and she tried to console us. And she asked if I had opened the window, and I said no. The curtains were open, and I shut them because I didn't want to look out the window. And yet it was still out there, floating outside my window. And she told us that she wanted us to sleep with her in her room tonight. So we did. And that's when I noticed, for the first time, that my grandmother's room had no windows in hers. It's no wonder why my grandmother would sleep there. There were no windows, and only one door that led inside. I laid awake the entire night, as I laid there next to her, sleeping on a couple of comforters. And I always wondered if that scarecrow was gonna come and get us. But sure enough, the dawn came the next morning, and everything was fine. And when I looked out the window, the scarecrow was back on its stake, as if nothing had happened. And to this day, I think back on that night and wonder what really happened. Did I dream that whole thing? No, I couldn't have. I woke up from my dream multiple times, and that first time was when I saw it in the window. It wasn't a dream. And also when I was completely awake in the daylight, and that thing just disappeared. I know, you may think I'm crazy, but I know what I saw. I saw my grandmother's scarecrow come alive and try to get us. So next time your parents or your grandparents tell you not to do something, maybe you should listen, because maybe there's a real reason why they're saying that. And it could mean the difference between living and dying. Thank you, everybody, for joining me for those 3 true scary stories. I hope you enjoyed them, and if you did, leave a like and subscribe. We're going to be coming out with different genres of stories every week. So this week's horror week, next week is fantasy week, the next week after that is sci-fi week, and then we're going to end with a comedy week. So funny stories. So if you like that, make sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell and set it to all so that you'll get all the different streams and notifications, and you can keep up to date with our channel. If you would like to hear more scary stories, then let me know in the comments below. Or if there was something about the scary stories that really intrigued you, or you have questions about it, also put it down in the comments below. And remember, as always, to stay spooky.